May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts and minds be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Many of you may know that in my former professional life, I was a lawyer, yes. And I will tell you that the law, you may know this, is all about assessing blame and then trying to determine damages, right? Basically, how much money do you get in compensation for the wrong that was done to you? That's how the law works. And if we're honest with ourselves, that's how most of us think most of the time, right? This person did me wrong. But the spiritual journey is not like that at all. The journey of the soul and heart is all about forgiveness. And this passage in the gospel is a wonderful, evocative story about the importance of forgiveness. And in conventional rabbinical teaching at the time, and even now, oftentimes, there was a separation between offenses to God and offenses to people. God would forgive offenses to God, and people could choose whether they wanted to forgive offenses to them. But in the crucible of Jesus' mind, that is a false dichotomy. There's no separation. The extent to which God forgives us, which is total, is the extent to which we should forgive other people. And so this story is all about linking those two. The fact that we have been forgiven infinitely and unconditionally by God means that we should do the same in our lives. Now, my parishioners know that my favorite theologian is a Franciscan named Richard Rohr, and so I'm going to read a quotation from Richard. He says, "If we're Christian, we've probably said the Our Father 10,000 times. The words just slip off our tongues. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. By saying this prayer, we've asked and prayed for forgiveness. Notice the full correlation between how we give and how we receive. Forgive us as we forgive. They're the same movement. We need to know that we need mercy. We need understanding. And then we also need to know how to give it. Each flows with the energy of the other. I have often found people in 12-step programs or in jail who are quite forgiving of other people's faults because they'd hit the bottom. They knew how much it hurt to hurt. They knew how terrible it is to hate yourself and to accuse yourself. When someone with a generous heart and a loving spirit entered their lives and forgave them, it was like being reborn. I remember when I was jail chaplain in Albuquerque, I would read in the newspaper the stories of criminals in our city, and I would form an opinion about how terrible they were. Years ago, a young woman committed murder to steal a baby. I didn't want to go in the cell because I knew I wouldn't like her. I knew I would judge her because I'd already judged her. When I left that cell, I had nothing but tears and sympathy for the suffering of that young woman. If we're honest, none of us have lived the gospel. None of us have loved as we could love, or as we have been loved by God. And yet that very recognition that I have not yet lived love allows me to stand under the waterfall of infinite mercy. It's only then that I know how to let mercy flow through me freely, that I receive it undeservedly allows me to give it undeservedly. So forgiveness is the key, or one of the keys, to the spiritual journey. If we decide to embark on this spiritual journey, if we decide to follow the deepest stirrings and yearnings of our heart to be grounded in God, then the spiritual practice on a daily basis is one of forgiveness. And so the question I often ask myself is it worth it? Does it work? And why do it? And in this particular parable from Jesus, I have to confess that the reason given at the end is a little unsatisfying to me. Because basically there's sort of a threat there. There's sort of a threat that, well, if you don't forgive the way God has forgiven you, then you're going to be tortured with hellfire and damnation. So that might be a very primal, fear-based reason to forgive, but what might be some other reasons to forgive? Does anyone have any practical experience with forgiveness? Yes, Carol.
When you forgive, you help yourself.
Yes, that is a very enlightened self-interest. It's really not so much about the other person. It's really about being able to let go of whatever anger and resentment you have been holding on to. Resentment is one of my favorite words. It's from a French word, ressentiment. Anyone take French in high school? What does sentiment mean? Or even in English, sentiment. What does that mean? What's a sentiment? It's a feeling. So re-sentiment, re-feeling means to feel again. So I call resentment spiritual acid reflux. It's basically a feeling that you're going to feel over and over and over again until you let it go. And forgiveness is the way that you let it go. Forgiveness is the way that you let it go. Now, easier said than done, right? Easier said than done, because a lot of times the hurts that we have experienced are deep wounds, deep traumas. Many of us have experienced abuse or neglect, or what I call the unholy trinity of betrayal, rejection, and abandonment. And so it takes a lot of effort and intention and cooperation with the grace of God to let go. But that's what Jesus is saying the spiritual journey is all about, to be able to forgive and let go. Now, if you're like me, sometimes the hardest thing to forgive, or the hardest person to forgive, is guess who? Yourself, right? Sometimes that's the hardest because many of us have been raised with very high moral standards, and we can be very generous towards other people, but we hold ourselves to those standards, and we are really good at beating ourselves up every single day. But it's equally important to practice forgiveness of oneself. And how about forgiving life? How about forgiving life for not being what we thought it was going to be, what it was supposed to be, the picture that we had in our minds of how it was going to work out, whether it was a relationship or whether it was a perfect Sunday service or whatever it might be. Can we also forgive life for being what it is? It's the only way to let go and to be free. Now, there's also what I call seminar level forgiveness. Seminar level forgiveness, because it's not just about doing it out of fear or even out of enlightened self-interest, as good as that may be, but sometimes it's just about if you choose to love. And if you choose to love, you choose to forgive, even if it hurts. And so I want to read this passage from someone I call an FOR, a friend of Richard. Her name is Cynthia Bourgeau. She's an Episcopal priest. And she writes a lot about forgiveness and Jesus as a wisdom teacher. And she says this: in order to become known to another, we must take the risk of loving that person. And this includes the real possibility of rejection and the even more painful prospect of heartbreak if the beloved is lost to us. Could it be that this earthly realm, not in spite of, but because of its very density and jagged edges, offers precisely the conditions for the expression of certain aspects of divine love that could become real in no other way? When we look at this process more deeply, we can see that those sharp edges call forth some of the most exquisite dimensions of love, qualities such as steadfastness, tenderness, commitment, forbearance, fidelity, and forgiveness. But when you run up against the hard edge and have to stand true to love anyway, what emerges is a most precious taste of pure divine love. I have often suspected that the most profound product of this world is tears. Tears express that vulnerability in which we can endure having our heart broken and go right on loving. In the tears flows a sweetness not of our own making, which has been known in our tradition as the divine mercy. Our jagged and hard-edged earth plane is the realm in which this mercy is the most deeply, excruciatingly, and beautifully released. That's our business down here. That's what we're here for. Who remembers what Jesus says on the cross about those who have crucified him? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. They know not what they do. What Jesus is saying there is that all hurt is basically rooted in some kind of spiritual ignorance. All hurt is basically rooted in some kind of spiritual ignorance. I remember years ago I heard a phrase, hurt people hurt people. And isn't that so true, that most of the wounds that we have received from other people, or which we have inflicted on other people, are because of our own wounds. And it's like a ricochet effect that just goes on and on and on. And what Jesus does on the cross in forgiveness is he says, I'm not going to pass on that wound or that hurt. And that was a terribly painful, excruciating, but ultimately truly loving thing that makes us pause in awe. And so when we are able to participate in that kind of forgiveness, we are really participating in the life and love of God. And so that is actually what baptism is all about. Baptism is all about the fact that we stand under the waterfall, literally the waterfall, of God's infinite mercy and forgiveness for all that we might do and all that might be done to us. That it is really just a bath in God's love forever. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.